You're listening to Let's Talk Creation.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And yeah, before we get started today, this is another odd episode. This is going to be an interesting one. Before we get started, please like the video. You might not like it when it's over. so you should like it now. Don't forget to subscribe if you're interested in what we're doing. Hit the notification bell if you want to know the latest things. If you're on YouTube, if you're on one of our many audio podcasting platforms, there are ways that you can leave reviews, and we would very much appreciate that. That helps to spread the word about what we're doing here and bringing you interesting, thought-provoking, deep dive content that you probably aren't going to hear pretty much anywhere else. And if you really appreciate that kind of work, we very much appreciate your support. And for those of you who have liked us and subscribed, we really appreciate you as well. So thanks for that. All right, Paul. I come to this topic with fear and trembling. Because I know this is a passionate point for a lot of people. And, we're probably going to step on some toes. So let me just say up front, before we even get started, my goal here is not to mock anybody or to make fun of anybody. I hope that every episode of Let's Talk Creation is the same, that we are never out here to make fun of anybody. There's enough of that in the creation evolution world. And I hope that our podcast is always going to be something of a haven. That said, there are certain ideas that get bounced around in creationism that we just, Paul and I feel kind of strongly that it's time to put them to bed. Those days have passed, and there's so much great stuff going on in creationism that we don't need to keep dragging up these old chestnuts. And I know that there are lots of people out there who think this is very important and very exciting, and they're strongly advocating for this. And I don't think you're bad people. I don't think you're stupid. I don't think any of those things. I just think we sincerely, honestly don't agree with each other about these particular issues. And what we're talking about here, because I haven't said anything about that yet, we're talking about the man tracks in the fossil record that go back, so far into the fossil record. And you find these man tracks deep in the fossil record, and they're supposedly, human footprints from the time of the dinosaurs, as you would say it in evolutionary terms. And of course, if this were true, it would be a real puzzle for the conventional evolutionary model. Yeah, if there were people alive walking around with the dinosaurs, that would be a real puzzle. But if you believe in biblical creation and you believe that dinosaurs were created along with the rest of the land animals on day 6, then you do believe that people were alive at some time when the dinosaurs were alive before the flood. And so maybe it wouldn't be such a shock to you to find out that there were some traces left in the fossil record of people from before the flood, doing stuff with dinosaurs, maybe. I don't know. So, I can understand that this is a humdinger of a kind of slam dunk kind of evidence that you might think, this is it, right? This shows the evolution model predicts one clear thing, and the creation model predicts totally the opposite. And it's a very, very stark contrast. It's not like there can be, ways to reinterpret evolution to fit this. Although, knowing evolutionary biologists, they would figure it out. All right. So the man tracks. Where do we begin? Why don't we begin with at the very beginning. And Paul, I
Well-
know you know a lot about this, a lot more than I do. So why don't you take us back, way back?
Well, actually, I'd like to begin in a slightly different place,
All
Todd,
right,
because the reason we'll come to the history because it is fascinating.
Yeah.
But the reason we kind of thought about doing this episode was because towards the end of last year, I was browsing through some recent issues of a science journal called Paleontology, which is published here in the UK by the Paleontological Association. And one of the papers in a recent issue just caught my attention. And I have a copy of it here. And the title of this paper is A New Solution to an Old Riddle. And as I read the abstract, I realized that the old riddle that was being referred to here in the title was the riddle of the dinosaur tracks in the bed of the Paluxy River at Glen Rose in Texas. And of course, that was the focus of this huge controversy. And it was huge. It was a huge evolution controversy that ran over several decades.
Yep.
And to some extent kind of still rumbles on today. And it was about the nature of the fossil tracks there in the Paluxy riverbed. And I want to come back to this paper at the end because it kind of adds a new spin to the Paluxy story, and it just shows that the Paluxy story is not finished yet. But that reading that paper made me think, we need to go back and we need to talk about the Paluxy story. So that then brings us to the history, which is fascinating. So let's kind of go right back to the beginning, and it actually starts quite a long time ago, really before the modern creationist revival. So I suppose we should set the scene first of all. So where does all of this take place? Glen Rose is a small town in Somerville County in Texas.
Correct.
It's located along the Paluxy River, which is a fairly fast-flowing river that runs for about 50 miles through northeastern Texas. And the volume of flow of the river varies quite a bit. So you get hot summers where the river dries up, and you get, sort of in the winter when it's very wet, sometimes, there's flooding. And this river runs through countryside that is underlain by lower Cretaceous rocks that belong to the Glen Rose Formation. Now, this rock formation has a conventional age of about 105 million years. So it's kind of dinosaur age rock, if you like. From a creationist perspective, I think most of us would agree that these are probably flood rocks. And this formation is composed of alternating layers of limestone and clay and sandstone. And at Glen Rose, the tracks that we're going to be talking about, the dinosaur tracks and these man tracks, are found in the lowermost layers in the Glen Rose Formation. So the story begins back in 1908 when there was a major river flood, one of the most sort of devastating floods, I think, that hit Glen Rose. And the flood stripped away an overlying layer of clay and exposed a limestone ledge on which there were fossil footprints, there were fossil tracks. And the local residents kind of, noticed these tracks, these fossil tracks. Most of them were clearly dinosaur tracks of one kind or another, but there were also other tracks that the local residents described as resembling giant human tracks. So these were tracks that were about 18 inches long. They were about 5 inches or so wide. They were roughly sort of oval shaped. They were spaced about 6 to 10 feet apart. And so they were kind of described as giant man tracks. And And over subsequent years, there were other similar discoveries nearby, other locations along the river. And in the period sort of leading up to the Great Depression, which I think peaked in the 1930s, this region of Texas was suffering, obviously, economically. And some of the enterprising local residents realized that they could dig these fossil tracks out of the river and sell them to make money. And I understand, a good dinosaur track would fetch maybe $50, which in those days I'm sure was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And the man tracks as well. You could dig these sort of man tracks out and sell those too. They made a bit less apparently. But dozens and dozens of these tracks were basically excavated from the river and sold so that local residents could feed their families. And it also seems that at this time, some of the locals manufactured tracks.
Right.
So if they weren't able to excavate tracks, they would carve tracks.
Limited
limestone
supply.
slabs.
So limited supply, $50 a track. Yeah, I can see why you would immediately start thinking, hey, just make my own, right?
Yeah. So this is nothing new, is it? There's still a trade in kind of fake fossils today. Yeah. So they kind of, manufactured tracks. They'd carve tracks of various kinds. And again, they'd sell them to make some money. And that brings us to kind of 1937, when a paleontologist called Dr. Roland T. Byrd, who was employed by the American Museum of Natural History in New York, he was on his way back from a fairly unproductive, I think, collecting season. And he stopped at a trading store in Gallup in New Mexico, where his attention was caught by a couple of slabs in the store window, which appeared to have these two sort of human-looking tracks on them. And he went into the store, he spoke to the store owner, and the store owner said, and I've got other tracks too. So he showed him some dinosaur tracks, and he said all of these tracks have come from the same location. They've come from the riverbed at Glen Rose in Texas. So Roland Byrd was intrigued by this. He was fairly sure at this point that the human tracks were fakes, that they were carvings. But he was intrigued by the dinosaur tracks. So he decided he was going to make a trip to go to Glen Rose and check out the site for himself. And that's what he did. And while he was there, he documented a number of dinosaur trackways of various types, including a set of sauropod prints. And they were, at that time, I think they were setting up a kind of a sauropod display in the museum that he worked for. And I think they excavated this set of dinosaur prints, took them back to the museum and sort of made them part of the display. And in May 1938, he wrote an article that was published in Natural History magazine, in which he describes the dinosaur tracks, and he also mentions the human-like tracks. And some of them he seems to dismiss as obvious fakes. He thinks they're carvings. Some that he'd actually seen at the location in situ in the riverbed, that locals had shown him these other so-called man tracks. He thinks they're dinosaur tracks. He thinks they're some kind of elongate track that's been left by a dinosaur that's walking in very soft mud. But anyway, he publishes this article, and at this point is when the creationists begin to get involved, because Roland Byrd's article is read by a number of creationists, particularly some who were associated with an organization that was called the Society for the Study of Creation, the Deluge, and Related Sciences, that was based in Los Angeles.
Yes.
And the society is so intrigued by this reference to these dinosaur and human tracks, side by side there at Paluxy, that they convened a committee to go and investigate, led by a geologist called Clifford Burdick. So Burdick gets in contact eventually with a guy called Al Berry, who is running a small sort of roadside museum, not at Glen Rose, but actually in Arizona, along Route 66. And he gets in touch with him because he finds out that this guy owns a number of fossil tracks that are said to have been sourced from the Glen Rose limestone. And so Burdick visits him, I think, and Berry tells him, yeah, you know, we've got these dinosaur tracks, and we've got the human tracks, and we've even got some saber-toothed cat tracks, and they've all come from Glen Rose. So Clifford Burdick takes an interest in the whole sort of Paluxy story, and for several decades, maybe over the next sort of 40 years, you know, he makes sporadic visits to Glen Rose. He writes about the Paluxy site and the track evidence in creationist articles. And these articles are eventually picked up by other creationists. Of course, most notably, they are picked up in 1961 in the Genesis Flood. So the Creationist Classic by Henry Morris and John Whitcomb, 1961, they have a section in the book on misplaced fossils, and they very prominently feature tracks that were, in fact, these photos are by Clifford Burdick. So these are tracks that Clifford Burdick was kind of popularizing. And you can see there's this sort of three-toed dinosaur track, and then you've got this clearly sort of human-like track with the 5 toes and so on. So that's 1961. And other creationists pick up on it too. Here in Britain, there was a very well-known creationist called A.E. Wilder Smith, and I have a copy of this book that was published in 1974, Man's Origin, Man's Destiny. And there's a whole section of photos in the middle of the book, also with the Paluxy tracks. So, you know, it gets widely popularized on both sides of the Atlantic. And of course, we're now coming towards the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. Henry Morris famously founds the Institute for Creation Research then in San Diego in California. And from the outset, ICR shows a great deal of interest in the Paluxy track evidence. Sure. And they actually organize several research trips. They send scientists to have a look at the site, sometimes in collaboration with other creationist organizations. And another guy who sort of gets involved at this time is a man called Stanley Taylor. He was the director of a Christian production company called Films for Christ Association. And he became very interested in the Paluxy tracks and decided he was going to commission a documentary movie about the Paluxy evidence that was eventually released in 1973 and called Footprints in Stone. Now, I confess, I have not seen Footprints in Stone. I don't know if you've seen this movie.
I haven't either, no.
I had a look to see if anybody had uploaded a copy of it online anywhere. And I can't find it. So if anybody knows, you know, a website where there's a copy of this movie, I'd be very interested to see it, because it was hugely influential at the time in promoting, you know, the man track kind of claims. And it was widely distributed. It was widely viewed in churches around America. I know that showings of the movie were organized here in Britain as well. So, you know, it was a very influential movie. I'd love to see a copy of it sometime. And so this was all sort of bringing the Paluxy site to the notice of the wider creationist community, the wider Christian community. And in 1980, Dr. John Morris, who was the son of the ICR president, Dr. Henry Morris, published this book tracking those incredible dinosaurs and the people who knew them, which is a whole book all about the Paluxy story. And I remember, reading this at the time, and like many other creationists, it was very exciting.
Sure.
And it's quite an impressive book. I don't know if you've read it, Todd, but it covers the history of the fossil discoveries at Paluxy. It covers the geological setting at Glen Rose in some detail. It describes all of the main track sites. It talks about the problem of carved tracks. It gives people's reactions to the finds, and it even tries to develop a kind of creationist model for sort of understanding how these tracks were formed in their geological context.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, so it's an impressive kind of book, a kind of case study. And I remember, reading that book. I've actually got another edition of it here with a slightly different cover. It obviously went through more than one edition, and that was very influential. So that's kind of the pro side of the Paluxy story.
Let me throw in a little.
Takes us through to the early 80s.
Yeah, let me throw in a little wrinkle there, because there is another side to this story that is generally not told. This is usually told in the creation evolution world. It's either by people who are still passionately excited about this evidence, or it's told as a terrible life lesson to learn that you don't trust what creationists say, right? Because the other shoe is about to drop in the history of this. We've gotten up to the early 80s and there's more to tell. But I wanted to share with you something. Years ago, I was doing historical research, and I happened to be at the archives at Andrews University in Michigan. And in the archives, they have the papers and correspondence that was saved by George McCready Price. And you know that name, Paul. Price is a very, very influential early 20th century creationist. He wrote a number of different books and promoted the idea of flood geology when a lot of people in America were not thinking in terms of flood geology. He is in some circles regarded as sort of the father of modern creationism. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but he certainly did a huge amount to promote flood geology. Now, you already mentioned that the Deluge Society was very interested in the tracks. Price was part of the Deluge Society. And as I was going through his correspondence there and reading the letters that were going back and forth between him and other creationists, I found a letter written by a guy named Byron Nelson. And you might remember Byron. Byron Nelson was a Lutheran, very prominent Lutheran pastor who was also had advanced training in genetics and wrote a book called After Its Kind, which was first published in 1927, which put forward a creationist view of the diversity of living things and how that fit into the Bible's description of things created after their kind. So here I am holding this letter signed by Byron Nelson, pretty exciting, to George McCready Price, and it's all about Paluxy.
Really?
Yeah, it was all about Paluxy. And it was clear that Byron Nelson was pretty agitated and even used a little saucy, sassy language as he rebuked Price and said, this can't possibly be what you think it is. Because there's no way at the very end of the flood, when the dinosaur fossils are being deposited, there's no way there are people out walking around at that time. He said the people were all dead and buried by that point. There's no way there could possibly be people out there. He was basing it on an understanding of the flood. And he said, no, this can't be what it seems to be. This must be something else. And you guys need to stop running off, stars in your eyes, thinking you've got the final nail in the coffin of revolution. and start thinking more carefully and be more critical in your view of Paluxy. So I thought that letter was utterly fascinating to read.
Yeah.
Something I ought to go back and dig up and get a scan of that so we can maybe get permission to post that somewhere, because it's usually the Paluxy story is almost always, if you're not a creationist, proposed as a story of how gullible and stupid we creationists are. But there's this other side where there were creationists even at the very beginning who thought, this is too good to be true. And there were others.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. I didn't know about that letter. I'd be fascinated to see it. So clearly there was contention in the ranks in the Deluge Society then about, the Paluxy evidence. No, that's fascinating. But you're absolutely right, because this is often forgotten that actually the first critics of the Paluxy Mantrax argument was other creationists.
Were other creationists, that's right.
Who and the one that the name that I know of is someone called Berney Neufeld. I have a copy here of an issue of Origins. This is published by the Geoscience Research Institute. This is a very early edition. It's volume 2, number 2, 1975. And in this issue, there is an article, Dinosaur Tracks and Giant Men by Berney Neufeld, that is in effect a critique of the Paluxy evidence. So what happened here is that quite early on, as the Paluxy story was sort of coming to prominence, a group of creationists who are associated with the Geoscience Research Institute, including Berney Neufeld, Art Chadwick, who we've had as a guest on this podcast in the past, and Leonard Brand, they were all kind of fresh, I think, out of graduate school at that time. They had heard the stories about these dinosaur and human tracks, and they wanted to go and investigate for themselves. So they went to Glen Rose, and they visited various sites along the river, and they did a quite detailed field study of one of the best track sites. So they took measurements and they took photos, and they made plaster casts of some of the more interesting tracks, and they did all that kind of stuff. And just like Roland Bird back in the late 30s, they found a variety of different types of dinosaur tracks, sauropod tracks. They're the big long neck, long-tailed dinosaurs. They found theropod tracks. So these are the kind of meat-eating, bipedal meat-eating dinosaurs. But their main focus was on various series of these elongate tracks that had been interpreted by many in the past as man tracks. What they found as they began to very closely examine these elongate tracks was that they started to reveal dinosaur characteristics. So they started to notice that there were claw marks evident at the end of some of these tracks.
Oh, claws.
So they seem to be poorly preserved dinosaur tracks where the soft mud had kind of backfilled the toe marks. So you were left with a sort of elongate track. There was another set of tracks that were in a layer above the main dinosaur track-bearing layer, and they were also claimed to be human tracks. And they also went to look closely at those and decided that they were basically just random erosional marks. The surface of these limestones is just full of sort of erosional marks, and some of these erosional marks at some point in the past had actually been painted with oil to sort of highlight what people thought were these tracks. And sometimes the kind of painting sort of accentuated features that made them look a bit more human-like than they really were. but they decided those were probably just erosion marks. And they also managed to locate some of the tracks which had been excavated from the Paluxy riverbed. And they were now owned by various individuals or organizations. And they were able to make arrangements and get agreements to cross-section some of these tracks with a diamond rock source. So you can kind of cut the track in half in order to test whether this is a genuine track. So if you've got a track that is genuine, what you would expect to see when you look at the track in cross-section is you would expect to see the layers in the sediment depressed below the track.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because you're squishing down into it. Yeah.
Squishing the mud.
Yeah.
So as the foot goes down into this soft mud, it bends the layers in the rock, in the sediment, as it was then, below the track. So they kind of follow the contour of the track. Whereas if you've got a track which is a fake, if you've got a track that was carved, then obviously the layers in the rock are just going to be truncated by the carving. So those layers will just sort of end abruptly where the track cuts into the rock. So they were able to get some of these tracks and take cross sections to have a look at them. And what they found, they had a look at one dinosaur track which had apparently recently been removed from the river. And when they cross-sectioned it, they found that the layers bent down below the track, which is exactly what you expect.
There you go.
From a genuine track. But then they got access to a number of tracks, dinosaur and human-like tracks, which were currently at Columbia Union College, which I think was in Maryland. And those tracks had actually originally been in the possession of Al Berry. Now, you remember I mentioned him. He was one of the contacts that Clifford Burdick had. And I think his collection had ended up at the college. And they were able to cross-section these tracks, and they proved to be carvings. I think some of the dinosaur tracks, as well as the human tracks, turned out to be carvings because the layers were just truncated by the tracks. The tracks just sort of cut through the layers. They also got some specimens that were owned by Clifford Burdick himself, including human-like and the cat-like tracks, the ones that were claimed to be saber-tooth cat tracks. And they cross-sectioned those, but the results there were inconclusive because when they cross-sectioned them, the limestone wasn't really layered. It had more of a mottled appearance, so they couldn't really tell one way or another, whether these were carvings or not. So anyway, 1975, one of this group from Loma Linda, Berney Neufeld, writes up the results of this investigation in this journal, Origins. And he concludes, to the dismay, I think, of many other creationists, that there was no good evidence at Paluxy for the existence of giant men or of the existence of humans and dinosaurs. So, what happened in the aftermath of this article being published?
Did anybody listen or respond?
Well,
I mean, this is before all those books are being written and movies being made. Did anybody pay any attention to these guys?
Unfortunately, no. His article is largely ignored by everybody. Creationists largely ignore it because it obviously doesn't agree with, the preconceived ideas that many creationists had. Evolutionists at this time are just not interested in the tracks. They're not showing any interest at all. So everybody ignores Neufeld's article. And the kind of creationist, the popular creationist interest in the Paluxy tracks just continues pretty much unabated right through the 1970s and into the early 1980s. And I think we also kind of have to remember what the context was here. So this was a time when there were these textbook controversies about, what should be taught in American textbooks in public schools. And there were legal battles going on in the courts about giving creationism equal time with evolution in the biology classroom. And, all of this was kind of going on. And the Paluxy man tracks kind of come to prominence and are being promoted right in the midst of all of this swirling controversy.
Legal stuff,
Yeah, legal stuff. And it's kind of in this context then that the first anti-creationist groups start getting organized because they want to combat these creationist efforts, to get creationism into the science classroom. And so you get the groups like the National Center for Science Education and, these sorts of lobby groups start springing up. And the anti-creationists at this point begin to realize that they can't ignore the Paluxy man track evidence any longer. So they decide that they're going to mount a kind of investigation of their own. And so in the early 80s, what you see is that in the journal of the NCSE, this anti-creationist group, you begin to get a few articles that are sort of critical of the Paluxy evidence, including a very critical review of the Footprints in Stone movie. And this is followed up in 1983 by a fairly detailed article that was published in the Journal of Geological Education by two authors, David Milne and Stephen Schafersman. And I've got it here, and it's got a great title. It's Dinosaur Tracks, Erosion Marks, and Midnight Chisel Work, but no human footprints in the Cretaceous limestone of the Paluxy Riverbed, Texas. So this article is basically published. And what they do is they review all of the published literature, all of the creationist literature, all of the photographs that are available. And they basically come to pretty much the same conclusions that Berney Neufeld had come to a decade earlier. They just basically confirm everything that Neufeld had written. They say that many of the tracks which had been removed from the river are of uncertain provenance. In other words, we don't really know where they came from. We don't have a good location information or which particular stratigraphic level these slabs came from. Some of them showed anatomically unrealistic features that suggested these are not real footprints. Yes. They came to the conclusion that many of these were probably carvings. They were almost certainly fakes. The tracks that were still in situ in the riverbed, they had a look at those. And they decided that many of them were just too vague and indistinct, really, to make much of anything of them. When they examined the four best sites, the sites that were claimed to have the best evidence of human tracks, they, like Neufeld, concluded that these elongate tracks were a combination of random erosional markings and tracks that were left by dinosaurs, where the toes had been backfilled, leaving this sort of vaguely human-like sort of impression in the sediment. They even suggested there was some evidence that some of the tracks had been deliberately tampered with, that there'd been there was a bit of chisel work going on to sort of alter them, to make them look a bit more human-like than they otherwise would. So that was 83. And there was a follow-up article in the same journal, 1987. This is an article by Ronnie Hastings, another anti-creationist. This one is called New Observations on Paluxy Tracks Confirm Their Dinosaurian Origin. And Hastings, he basically visited the area with another researcher, Glen Cuban. Glen Cuban, I don't know that much about the kind of backstory of Glen Cuban, but I understand he was, at least early on, he was broadly sympathetic to creationism. But anyway, he and Ronnie Hastings sort of visit Paluxy. They go there in 84 and 85. They particularly make a study of the Taylor site, where there was a particular trail of tracks that were claimed to be man tracks. And they made some really important observations. They again were able to show that many of these tracks had evidence of splayed claw marks at the end that had been infilled by the soft mud. They also noticed that there were sometimes what they called colour distinctions where the claws would have been. So sometimes the kind of the marks of the claws could be made out by this kind of reddish brownish staining that highlighted, the three sort of toe marks of the dinosaur print. And when these tracks were then exposed to the air, sometimes that color distinction would become even more vivid, probably because of some oxidation reaction. So you're getting some, oxidation is kind of picking out some subtle sort of chemical difference in the material that's infilling the toe marks and the surrounding limestone. So they make some really important observations, and they eventually invite John Morris from ICR, who'd written the book, tracking those incredible dinosaurs. They invite him, and they also invite Paul Taylor of Films for Christ, who's the son of Stanley Taylor, who'd commissioned the movie, to come and meet with them at Glen Rose and have a look at the evidence together and discuss, these new observations. And so that's what they do. I think they meet on more than one occasion, if I remember. And as a result of these discussions, ICR begins to kind of back away from the claims about the Paluxy man tracks. So in 1986, this is a year or so later, ICR publishes one of their impact articles, this one, The Paluxy River Mystery, written by John Morris. And in this little impact article, John Morris says this. He says, "It is now improper for creationists to continue to use the Paluxy data as evidence against evolution." And he concedes that none of the 4 trails at the Taylor site can today be regarded as unquestionably of human origin. So, in effect, he's publishing a kind of
it's a retraction
of much of the evidence.
And he took the book out of circulation, didn't he? Didn't they do that?
Well, at first, I think what happened was the book was still in circulation, but they put the impact article in as an insert.
Okay.
And
well,
then
they sold
I think
through the last of the stock, I imagine.
So probably that's what happened. They probably sold through the last of the stock, and then it kind of went out of print.
Okay.
They had a Paluxy display, I understand, in the museum, which they kind of screened off from the public. And Films for Christ withdrew the movie from circulation at that time. And you've got to think, that was a tough decision for those guys to make.
Yeah.
They were heavily invested in much of this evidence. They'd been, this had been something that they'd invested a lot of time and effort in for, a couple of decades. And, it took some courage, I think, to kind of say, put their hands up and say, we got this one wrong. Yeah. And, and admit that they'd basically made a mistake.
Yeah, they got a lot.
So I don't think we should be too.
Yeah, they get a lot of flack.
I don't think we should be too hard on them.
Yeah,
they did get a lot of flack, and they get a lot of pushback because obviously there are always people who want them to go further.
Yeah, that's right.
And think that they're being a bit mealy mouthed maybe about some of their retraction, but I think credit where credit's due. They admitted they made a mistake. Yeah. And so that kind of then, brings us to the present day. So today, I think it's fair to say that all of the big creation organizations, whether it's ICR, AIG, CMI, they have basically completely dropped the Paluxy man trap evidence. Correct. In fact, they list it in the list of arguments that creationists shouldn't use. You may remember a few episodes back, we did
That's right.
an episode, arguments creationists should avoid, and they list the Paluxy argument as one of those. But you and I know that hasn't always filtered out into the wider community.
No.
So you will still find this argument surfacing on the internet and on social media. And there are still some creationists who, I guess we might say, are kind of on the fringe outside of the big creation organizations.
Kind of just doing their own thing.
Who continue to promote. Yeah, and they continue to promote the authenticity of the tracks. Yeah, so that kind of brings us brings us up to date.
I remember growing up with the Genesis flood in our house and reading it and seeing those. I mean, those pictures were striking. The picture of those giant footprints with the guy and his bare foot stuck on the top of it to show you how big they were.
Yeah.
And to think about, the Bible says in those days there were giants in the earth, and this is it. These are the giants. And then, you, as you do, you grow up and you learn things. And I remember in grad school, the first time I came across Glenn Cuban's website, so Glenn Cuban not only did all this work with Paluxy firsthand, but he also went on to create this massive website about the Paluxy track history. And he's pretty antagonistic towards that and towards creationists promoting these claims. And I remember looking at his website and reading through his research, and it's the first time I had seen anti-Paluxy stuff, and discovering, I remember very distinctly this beautiful map of the track site, and it had all there's just a bunch of dinosaur tracks everywhere, and then he had this trackway of human prints highlighted, and it went literally on one end, it was all little tiny human prints, and at the other end of the trackway, you could clearly see the big toes of the three-toed theropod dinosaur, and I thought, well, that really kind of clinches it. This isn't what I thought it was. And then, of course,
and in fact, that I was going to say that variability of the prints along an individual trackway is actually one of the clues that might help us to understand what is actually going on in how these tracks were made, which we'll come to.
We'll get to that in here in a second. Yeah. And so that struck me so forcefully as I'm reading through this, just trying to sort out the anti-creationist side from, well, what is the actual data? Yeah, that was striking. And then nowadays, people still send me regularly. I got one just last fall where they'll send me this picture of a track and they will say, what do you think of this? And it's so awkward. I feel so bad because I can tell now as an adult and as a mature scientist who has spent a lot of time studying anatomy and foot anatomy and so forth. And I can tell, looking at this thing, somebody carved it. I can just see it. This is not anatomically correct. I don't care. It's not the size so much, the 18-inch long prints. It's the fact that it looks like it was drawn by a 7-year-old and then carved into the rock. And I always feel bad because, they're clearly very excited about it, but I just write back, this is obviously a carving. There's nothing about this anatomy that suggests that this is a real foot that made this thing. So
yeah.
Sorry, I have to rain on everybody's parade.
Yeah.
But it is really, really, really obvious. Once you know more about dinosaur feet, you know more about human feet. Some of those dino tracks carved into those rocks look like Godzilla. They look like totally fictional feet. So
Yeah, and it's not that we kind of want to take any sort of delight or pleasure in bursting the bubble, but that as Christians we believe that the truth matters, right?
It does.
The truth is important, and we have to just have that uppermost in our mind that the truth matters. We don't need human footprints in the Paluxy River to support creationism at the end of the day.
I don't.
And if we kind of hitch our wagon to something that is so clearly, after all these years, spurious, we're not actually doing our cause any favors. So I think there are some lessons that we should take away from all of this, and maybe we could think about that. I think one of the lessons is always to be very wary of what I like to call magic bullet type arguments. Mm-hmm. And I think we've kind of touched on this probably before. There is clearly an appeal to finding human tracks alongside dinosaur tracks, because as you said
earlier,
discovery in one fell swoop,
there goes evolution.
Kind of demolished. Yep. There goes the evolutionary model. I'm not quite so sure actually about that. maybe not. But when we're thinking about, reconstructing the history of the Earth, things are rarely that straightforward. Yeah. Where you just find this one big knockdown argument that kind of solves all your problems. That isn't how things work. There are no shortcuts to doing the hard work of trying to understand carefully the geological and paleontological data. We have to be thinking about how we understand the broad sweep of data, not getting so focused on these anomalies, that we think are going to just bypass all the hard work for us. And so I think there's some real dangers there. This sort of reliance on magic bullets. Yeah. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think we can take away from the Paluxy story is the importance of careful, critical research and review. I was very struck by something that Berney Neufeld said in his article. Let me just quote this, because I was very struck by this. I think it's his last sort of comment in the conclusion. He says, in any kind of investigation, but especially when investigating the past where data is more equivocal, caution and thoroughness should characterize the work done, and conclusions should not be drawn prematurely.
Yeah.
Well, amen to that. So, it's interesting to me that the earliest criticisms of the Paluxy argument came from other creationists, but that they were ignored.
Yeah.
And how history might have been different had people paid more attention to some of these early criticisms.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because when I think about sensational ideas, sometimes I find things that I think this is really surprising, right? In my own research, I may find something really surprising and unexpected. And my immediate reaction as a trained scientist, my immediate reaction is, this must be wrong. And I'm thinking immediately of, all right, well, what's all the other possible explanations? Let's test and make sure that it's not this, and it's not that, and it's not the other thing. And I'm running through every scenario I can to come up with all the different possible things that I have to rule out before I accept this extraordinary thing, even if I want to accept it. I just think that it can't be that easy. Right. It can't be that easy.
No.
And I think that's something that, I think, I don't know. It's a habit that needs to be cultivated a lot in people, that you need to be skeptical of things, and you need to be most skeptical of the things that you're most excited about.
Yeah. hindsight's a wonderful thing.
Oh, brother, yeah.
But yeah, the lesson from Paluxy is that it is very easy to ignore data that we just find inconvenient.
Yeah.
And we need, like you say, to discipline ourselves not to do that. And also, I think sometimes criticism from friends, and like I say, it was creationists publishing a lot of the critical stuff early on. Criticism from friends can be particularly hard to take because they're meant to be on our side.
You're supposed to be on my side. Yeah.
So what are you doing? Taking away my favorite piece of evidence. But we need good criticism and review, and it might be better that it comes from our own side than it. We wait for the anti-creationists to kind of tear us to bits about it.
Always, because they are predators and they don't care. And at least I care about other creationists. It may not seem that way sometimes.
Yeah.
But I do care deeply about the health of the creationist community. And if that means we have to root out some silly ideas, well, yeah, we should do that. We should be willing to do that.
Yeah, we should be our own worst critics.
Absolutely.
We should. Yeah, we should. Yeah. And I think, one final lesson, and this kind of brings me back to that article in Paleontology that I began with, is that scientific ideas continue to change, and the Paluxy story is not over yet.
Nope.
You see, it was always a bit of a mystery as to why the dinosaur tracks at Paluxy were that strange elongate shape that you could mistake for a human track. And as you say, you could even look along a single trackway and find that the tracks transitioned to something that was much more a traditional three-toed dinosaur track.
Right.
So what on earth was going on?
Right.
And to understand this, you have to understand that the dinosaurs that made these tracks were usually toe walkers.
Mm-hmm.
So they would walk on their toes.
Right.
So the rest of the foot was actually raised off the ground. And so they would leave a three-toed track that did not have that kind of long, if you like, heel impression that you find in many of those Paluxy tracks. And back in the 1980s, Glen Cuban, interested as he was, in what was going on at Paluxy, he proposed an explanation. He proposed that what was happening was these dinosaurs were, instead of walking on their toes, they were actually walking in a kind of weird flat-footed fashion. So they were crouching low to the ground.
Yeah.
And they were putting the whole of the foot down on the ground, and it was leaving this long metatarsal print. It's this long elongate track.
Right. It's a weird model because why would they?
It is a very weird model.
And why wouldn't they leave a tail mark if they're sliding down that much to put the back of their foot down? That seems really
very
odd.
weird. It seems very unnatural.
Yeah.
And what this paper is about in paleontology is basically challenging Glen Cuban's explanations. They're basically saying they think that's wrong. So they've come up with a different explanation because they say this weird sort of crouching posture doesn't explain actually the characteristics of the tracks that we see at Paluxy. So what you'd expect if a dinosaur was kind of in this strange posture was you would expect it to be making very short steps, but with a very wide gauge. But that's not what you see.
Yeah.
You actually see a narrow gauge and quite large stride, as if the dinosaur was moving pretty normally.
Yeah.
So that doesn't fit. And it doesn't really explain why the prints are so poorly preserved. Why do they lack anatomical detail? Why are the toes usually filled in? So there are some things about the tracks at Paluxy that don't kind of fit with Glenn Cuban's explanation. So they're proposing that, in fact, these tracks were produced by dinosaurs walking in a normal fashion, but in very, very soft mud, where the foot is sometimes very deeply penetrating the mud. So the foot is kind of going in at a fairly vertical, a steep angle going into the mud. But because it's going a long way down, the whole foot is leaving an impression, this elongate impression in the mud. And as the foot presses down on the mud to give it traction, to give it forward thrust, it actually even elongates the track. It becomes even longer than it might otherwise be. The metatarsal part of the foot, is kind of pushing backwards. And then as it comes up back out of as it withdraws from the sediment is kind of infilling the toes. And what you end up with is just a very vague, elongate, oval impression in the mud. And they have some illustrations, they have some diagrams kind of showing how they think this works. And they think that this helps to explain the features of the dinosaur tracks at Paluxy, the fact that the stride length is quite long, that the gauge is narrow, that there doesn't seem to be any change in stride or speed. It explains the variability of the tracks, because sometimes the dinosaurs are walking on a firmer sediment surface than at other times. Maybe parts of the sediment are very soupy and deep, and other parts are firmer. So it explains how the tracks can vary along a particular trackway. It explains the poor preservation of the dinosaur tracks, and why generally the toes are very indistinct or absent. So they're arguing that this is a new explanation for what are actually very peculiar dinosaur tracks, sort of atypical dinosaur tracks.
Seems like the thing to do would be to take one of the elongate tracks and section it long ways, because you should see the foot going down into the mud. It should leave a trace there, right?
Right. You may be able to think of ways that this model could be tested.
Yeah.
And more work could be done. And I'm sure this isn't the final word. Other people will be doing more research. Paluxy isn't the only place where these elongate tracks are found. There are some other places around the world where elongate tracks are found. So so it'll be very interesting. And not all elongate tracks necessarily form the same way. Some elongate tracks, and the authors acknowledge this, form in other ways. Some of them are sliding tracks, where dinosaurs slipped in the mud and left a long track.
Yep.
But those don't have the same characteristic traits, because usually, dinosaur slips and you get one print that looks like that, or maybe a couple of prints, but not a whole trail.
Yeah.
So there are ways to sort of distinguish, what the different modes of origin might be. So anyway, there we are. So the story at Paluxy is not finished. It's
done.
Still being written.
Yeah, not done. Well, thank you, Paul. This has been a fascinating history lesson. For all of you listening and ready to send us hate mail, please don't. If you don't agree with us, cool. That's fine. You're entitled to your opinions. That's just as we are entitled to ours. That's okay. But this has been a fascinating episode, and I do think the story on Paluxy is still out. I still wonder, Paul, how in the world do we preserve footprints at all in the fossil record? They are such ephemeral little things. It seems like very special kind of circumstances are necessary to make them stick around for so long. And maybe that's a story for another day. I think we're out of time here. So let's remind everyone, you can find out more about Let's Talk Creation at our website, coresci.org/podcast. You can send us an email if you'd like to, podcast@coresci.org. Let us know what you think about the podcast. Let us know about what you'd like to hear on future podcasts. Let us know what your questions are. Maybe we'll address those in a future episode. Again, I would remind you, if you're watching us on YouTube, click that like button, click that subscribe button, click that bell button if you want to be notified when we release new content. If you're listening to us on another platform, we would very much appreciate a positive review of our work. If you've enjoyed what we do, and if you like the style and the depth in which we approach these issues, like today's episode was pretty in depth. We are sponsored by Core Academy of Science that in the United States. If you're in the United States and you'd like to support us financially, you can find out more at coresci.org/connect. We'll give you links to important content that we want you to check out. coresci.org/donate is where you can find out information about how you can financially support our work. And in the UK, Paul, tell us about Biblical Creation Trust.
Yes, if you go to our webpage, biblicalcreationtrust.org, there's a donate button on the homepage, and that takes you to a giving page where you can select various options. If you're in the UK, you can send us a check, or you can make a direct bank transfer, or you can give via stewardship. If you're in the USA, or if you're overseas, there's a PayPal option. You'll find it all there on the giving page. And you'll also find us on social media, so check us out on Facebook.
Definitely, yes. And Let's Talk Creation is also on all your social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and so forth. And you can look us up there. Find that at coresci.org/podcast. We'll have links to all of our social media. And that's another great way to get in touch with us if you want to leave some comments or post some questions or something like that. If we might respond, we might save it for a future episode. Who knows? So I think that wraps it up for this time. Thanks, Paul, for sharing all that great stuff with us, and we will see you next episode.
See you next time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.